March 1945, Bavaria. A Messerschmitt staggers through the Rye Valley sky with a wound that will not heal, oil burning, hydraulics hissing, the canopy crazed with spiderweb cracks. At the controls, Captain Hans Werner Lurch, 26, one of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned test pilots. He is alive for the moment, and that is the only certainty. Above him, American fighters orbit like hunters that have already drawn blood. Below him, fields he has flown over 1,000 times now blur together as enemy territory. The altimeter spins. 2,000 feet, 1,500. He knows the real fear is not the ground, it is what waits on it. For years, the Reich's propaganda machine has rehearsed this moment in every German mind. Capture means torture. Interrogation means broken bones. Test pilots vanish into secret prisons or are traded to the Soviets, which is worse. He has seen what happens to downed Americans inside the Reich. Some units respect the rules, others do not. And the SS? He has heard the stories told in quiet rooms by officers who hate what their uniforms have been made to mean. Why would the enemy be any different? Why would mercy be part of this script? 1,000 feet. The fighter that raked him with .50 caliber fire is gone, but its message remains. Time to jump or die. Lurch's right hand trembles as it fumbles the harness. His left hand finds the canopy release, slick with his blood. Shrapnel in the shoulder, the pain arrives in waves that pulse with his heartbeat, warm and wet inside a flight suit, already stiff with oil. He thinks of Hildegard. He thinks of their daughter in Bad Wurshofen. Will they receive a telegram or nothing at all? Will he become one more name that disappears into rumor and fear? 500 feet. He rips the canopy free and throws himself into the cold. The parachute snaps him upright so violently it steals the air from his lungs. Pain tears white across the injured shoulder. Below, his Messerschmitt scythes a furrow through a farmer's field and expires in a pillar of black smoke against a blue spring sky. 4 years of test-flying jet prototypes, late war variants, desperate engineering miracles condensed into twisted metal. He drifts, powerless and exposed, toward a fate his instructors warned him about in half-joking tones that never quite hid their edge. Boots in the grass, American voices. Rifles up. Lurch hits hard. Then the chute drags him until he finds the quick release and slaps it with his good hand. He rises, swaying, his left arm useless, blood dripping to green blades that do not care. He lifts his right hand, palm open, every gesture deliberate. The universal grammar of surrender spoken by men who want to live 60 seconds longer. A sergeant closes the distance, young, tired, calculating. Another soldier circles behind and pats him down. No pistol, no maps. Only a blood-streaked flight suit and a metal cross someone pockets without ceremony. Luftwaffe, the sergeant says, reading the wings. We got us a Kraut pilot. Lurch understands enough English to recognize the word that names him enemy. This is the pivot. The narrative he was fed expects an impact. Here, a rifle butt, a boot, a shot. Instead, the barrel lowers. Medic, the sergeant barks, urgency replacing anger. A kid with freckles arrives at a run, Red Cross on a canvas bag, and kneels in the mud with the instinct of someone who has done this too often. Scissors, flash, fabric parts. The probing is careful, the language gentle, even when the words do not land. Morphine burns warmth into a world that had narrowed to pain. The sergeant lights a lucky strike and offers it across the space between enemies. The taste is real tobacco, not the ersatz of a starving nation. It should not be this way, and yet it is. On paper, nothing about this scene is sentimental. It is doctrine and discipline. It is the laws of war applied by men still shaking from a fight. It is a calculation that a living prisoner yields more truth than a corpse, that order beats vengeance, that the best way to finish a war is to demonstrate how you intend to win a peace. But to the pilot on the ground, drifting on morphine and smoke, it feels like the floor of the world has shifted. The sergeant's question, name, is not an opening to cruelty, but an invitation back into being human. Hans Werner Lurch, he manages. The syllables thick and fragile. You picked a hell of a day to fall out of the sky, the sergeant replies. And for the first time since the bullets hit, the future becomes a thing that might exist. The Jeep jolts over rutted roads past barns, splintered by blasts and tanks that have cooled into rust's first moments. Someone tips a canteen to Lurch's lips and says, "Easy, small sips." Every motion denies a rumor he has lived with since 1941. Field hospital, white sheets that smell of soap, sun through glass, beds where Americans and Germans occupy the same grid of clean linen. A captain named Morrison speaks German with the solid, careful cadence of a student who respects the language. "Because you are wounded," she says, when he asks the question. He cannot hold back. "Why are you helping me?" As if it were the most obvious rule in the world. Dressings changed on time. Penicillin, the miracle many German wards only spoke about. Hot meals that taste like a country not rationing its future. Coffee that reminds him this is a different economy, a different capacity, a different war being waged behind the lines. 3 days pass, and with them, the reflex to flinch. Lurch takes inventory. The Americans do not trade bandages for answers. They do not withhold pain relief to pry open a mouth. The young private from Iowa teaches him, "Thank you," sticking his tongue between his teeth to form the foreign sound. They both laugh when he fails and try again. The structure around him is relentless and impersonal. Yet, inside that structure, there is space for something softer care delivered without condescension, routine performed with competence that reads as respect. Then the door opens for the next act. A major from the United States Army Air Forces pulls a chair beside the bed and speaks German that needs no apology. Patterson, he does not threaten. He frames the moment with the flat facts of a collapsing Reich and the more complicated question of what comes after. The Americans have captured jets and rocket planes. The manuals are not enough. They need a mind that knows how a machine feels on the edge of stall, what a compressor surge sounds like in the bones, which failures are design and which are desperation. The offer is not mercy dressed as charity. It is a transaction made in daylight. Work with us. Do the job you were born to do. The alternative is a cage and a slow drift home to ruins when the paperwork clears. Lurch measures the proposition against the weight of the photograph he keeps in his pocket, the one where sunlight blessed a moment that seems impossible now. He measures it against the sound the Packard Merlin made as it passed him 2 weeks ago, and the way his own engine coughed when he asked it for more than it could give. He hears the unspoken truth in Patterson's voice. This is how professionals end wars, by turning knowledge into bridges. "I will help," he says, because there is no other honest sentence. A hand extends. He takes it. The war is not yet ended, but something inside him does, and something else begins. Outside, trucks move, orders circulate, the front advances. Inside, the pilot who fell from the sky learns that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a choice. To lower a rifle, to call a medic, to treat an enemy as a patient, to turn a prisoner into a colleague. In the next days, fences and guards will reappear around him, but so will runways and maintenance crews and hangars humming with a project that looks past the ruins toward the horizon. He expected a lesson in fear. He is receiving a demonstration of order of values enforced not by speeches, but by schedules, checklists, and small, consistent mercies, the kind that leave a mark deeper than scars. The secure compound near Frankfurt was nothing like the prison Hans had imagined. There were fences, yes, barbed wire, checkpoints, sentries with rifles, but there were also proper quarters, real beds, clean uniforms, and food that tasted like the pre-war years. The Americans called it an evaluation site. To Hans, it felt like another planet. The officer in charge was Colonel Raymond, a former P-47 Thunderbolt pilot. His handshake was firm, his tone practical, his curiosity genuine. "You Germans gave us hell in the air," he said one evening over dinner, slicing pot roast with the precision of a man used to instruments and gauges. "Lost 2 good wingmen over France in '44. What made your training so damn effective?" Hans hesitated, unsure if this was interrogation or conversation. Raymond's expression gave him his answer: professional respect, not manipulation. "We had time," Hans said finally. "Early in the war, before the shortages, we trained for hundreds of hours. Later, we sent boys up with 50 hours in the cockpit. They died in days." Raymond nodded grimly. "Same story here. War eats its young." He raised his glass to the ones who didn't make it ours and yours. They drank. For the first time since the Reich began collapsing, Hans felt something he hadn't in years: empathy without guilt, respect without ideology. Over the following weeks, Hans joined a team of American test pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers. At first, the atmosphere was cautious, almost sterile. But as hours turned into days, and days into flight data, and grease-stained notebooks, professional curiosity overpowered old hostility. They examined captured aircraft together, BF 109 seconds, for 190 seconds, Me 262 jets, debating every bolt, every angle of lift and thrust. Captain Jake Larson, a Mustang pilot with 4 German kills, was among the first to warm to him. "Your 109 turns better than my P-51 at low altitudes," Larson admitted during one hangar session. "But up high, we own the sky." Hans chuckled softly. "We never solved the supercharger issue. And your range? My God, your Mustangs could fly to Berlin and back while ours ran dry after an hour." Larson grinned. "That's Packard Merlin for you, plus drop tanks." Though the first time I saw a Me-262 jet scream past, I thought the devil himself had joined your Air Force. Their laughter echoed through the hangar. 2 former enemies dissecting the tools of their trade like surgeons comparing scars. The breakthrough came when Patterson and Raymond handed Hans the keys, figuratively, to a captured P-51 Mustang. They had repainted it in Luftwaffe markings for evaluation. "She's yours for the day, Captain," Patterson said. "Put her through her paces. Tell us what you think." Climbing into the cockpit, Hans felt an unexpected reverence. The ergonomics were simple, the gauges clean, the canopy wide. He went through the pre-flight checklist with an American engineer, exchanging nods where language failed. When the Packard Merlin engine came alive, the sound was unlike any Daimler or Junker's machine, deep, confident, symphonic. Throttle forward. The plane leapt ahead like a predator uncaged. The acceleration pressed him into the seat, violent, beautiful. Within seconds, he was climbing through cloud, laughing out loud for the first time in months. The Mustang was a masterpiece. Smooth roll rate, flawless control balance, superb visibility. For 40 minutes, Hans forgot sides and symbols. He remembered only why he had chosen the sky in the first place. When he landed, Patterson and Larson were waiting. "Well?" Patterson asked. Hans stepped down from the cockpit, face flushed with exhilaration. "It is magnificent," he said simply. "Superior to the 109 inches, almost every way visibility, range, climb rate, in a good pilot's hands, unstoppable." Larson smirked. "Any weaknesses?" "High-speed roll could be better," Hans admitted. "An ammunition load light for ground attack. But as a fighter—" He paused, the words heavy with truth. "Now I understand why we lost." It was the first time he said it aloud, why we lost. Not just a nation, but an idea. In the cold hangar, surrounded by engineers from both sides of a world war, the statement hung like smoke. It was not surrender, it was acknowledgement. That night, over dinner, the tension was gone. Photos appeared. Larson showed his fiancée, Sarah, smiling in Michigan sunlight. Morrison displayed pictures of his children. "Haven't seen them in 18 months, he said quietly. Hans reached into his flight jacket and unfolded his own photograph, Hildegard, and their 3-year-old daughter. "My family," he said. The Americans looked at the picture with warmth, not judgment. "Beautiful," Larson murmured. "Your little girl looks just like her." "She is 3, Hans said. "If I am gone too long, she will not remember me." Larson clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll get back to them, Lurch. War's ending. You'll be home telling her about the crazy Americans you met." Hans smiled, but it trembled. For the first time, he realized he wanted to believe it. That night, lying in his bunk, he tried to reconcile everything. For years, he had been told the Americans were monsters, materialists, brutes, executioners in uniform. Yet they were engineers, fathers, men who laughed and grieved the same way. Their mercy was not weakness. Their discipline was not propaganda. It was principle enforced even when revenge would have been easier. In those quiet hours, Hans understood something new. Germany had not only lost to American machines, it had lost to American values, to the idea that power means restraint, that strength includes compassion. The next morning, when the sirens blared announcing Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8th, Hans did not feel humiliation. He felt release. The war was over. But for him, the real transformation had only begun. The news of Germany's surrender spread through the American base like a gust of wind sweeping away years of exhaustion. Some pilots cheered. Others simply sat in stunned silence, their hands trembling as the weight of survival finally pressed down. Hans Werner Lurch stood at a window in the officers' mess, staring at the morning light cutting through the clouds. The war was over. His country was gone. He listened to the laughter, the toasts, the songs of relief in languages that only weeks ago had meant danger.
You'll get back to them, Lurch.
Across the room, Captain Jake Larson clinked glasses with the young lieutenant and gestured toward Hans.
Crazy Americans.
"Come on, Lurch," he called out. "You've got more reason than any of us to celebrate. You survived both sides of this damn war." Hans smiled faintly. "It does not feel like celebration," he said. "Only ending." Larson nodded, his grin fading. "For most of us, that's enough." But the end wasn't truly an end, not for Hans. In the weeks that followed, the Americans kept him on the roster. He was too valuable to send home to ruins. Each day, he flew captured aircraft, German, Italian, even a Japanese Zero brought in for comparative analysis. He wrote reports that bridged two worlds: the precision of a German engineer and the curiosity of an American experimentalist. The Americans began calling him Captain Lurch, without irony. His uniform changed khaki instead of gray, but his flight log continued. His signature, once written under the swastika, now appeared beneath a blue star and a white bar. He had become something the propaganda of both nations could never explain. A man who had fought for the Reich, but now served its conquerors, not through coercion, but through conviction. Then one August morning, Major Patterson summoned him to a private office. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and secrecy. "Captain Lurch," Patterson began, "you've done exceptional work. The Navy's Test Pilot Division has taken notice." He slid a file across the desk. "They're offering you a civilian contract, immediate release from POW status, full pay, and if you wish, permission to bring your family to the United States." Hans froze. "You want me to come to America?" "Not as a prisoner," Patterson said. "As an employee, an expert." He paused. "Your knowledge will help us shape the next decade of aviation. Jet propulsion, high-altitude flight, control surface testing, you've lived it. And frankly, Captain Germany won't be building planes for a long time." Hans stared at the papers, his mind racing between gratitude and guilt. "There are many in my country who would call that betrayal." Patterson leaned forward, his voice steady. "There's nothing left to betray. Your country is in ruins, but your skills, those can still build something. Think of it as saving what's worth saving." Hans said nothing for a long moment. His thoughts were of Hildegard and their daughter, living amid rubble and ration cards. The house gone, the future uncertain. America wasn't just an offer, it was survival. That night, he wrote to his wife. "They have offered me something impossible, a way to fly again, to bring you here. I do not know if it is right, but perhaps after everything, right is what helps us live." 2 weeks later, her reply arrived, the paper thin and smudged from travel through occupied zones. "The house is destroyed. We live with my parents in one room. There is no food. If the Americans will take us, we must go. Our daughter asks for you every day, but soon she will forget your face. Come, if this country is to heal, let us at least survive to see it." That letter decided everything. By December 1946, the paperwork was done. Hans Werner Lurch, former Luftwaffe test pilot, now a civilian contractor for the U.S. Navy, boarded a transport flight bound for Washington, D.C. His wife and daughter followed weeks later, flown in under special authorization. When they stepped off the plane, the reunion was wordless.
Want me to come to America?
Hildegard's tears came first, Hans's followed. Their daughter, shy and hesitant, stared at the man in the strange uniform until she heard him whisper, "Papa." Then she ran into his arms. They were given a small house near Patuxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland, modest but whole, running water, electricity, a refrigerator that hummed with the sound of peacetime. The neighbors, curious at first, grew to accept them. America in 1947 was confident and hungry for progress, too busy building the jet age to dwell on who had once been an enemy. Hans began flying again, first as a test consultant, then as a full-time pilot. He helped evaluate early U.S. jet designs, advised engineers on airframe stress, and introduced German aerodynamic techniques that improved stability at transonic speeds. He flew everything from the Navy's F-9, F-Panther, to experimental prototypes that brushed the edge of Mach 1. But beyond the technical, Hans understood he had become something symbolic, a bridge between those who once sought to destroy each other. He and his American colleagues worked side by side, not as victors and vanquished, but as pioneers in the same sky. Sometimes, during long test flights, Hans would glance at the horizon and remember that March day over the Rhine, the fire, the blood, the sergeant's lowered rifle. That single moment had rewritten his life's trajectory as surely as any thrust vector or lift coefficient. In interviews years later, Hans would say, "I should have died that day, but they saved me. They didn't have to." That's what makes it powerful. He often thought about the unknown sergeant, the man whose choice of compassion over vengeance had altered not only his life, but his family's, and perhaps, in small ways, the course of history itself. The years that followed turned Hans Werner Lurch from a survivor into a cornerstone of the new aviation world. By 1949, he was a familiar figure at the Patuxent River Naval Air Station. Captain Lurch, the German test pilot with the calm eyes and clipped accent. Engineers and pilots trusted him. Younger flyers sought him out for advice. What had begun as a wartime compromise evolved into a quiet partnership between former enemies, a collaboration that would define the early jet age. He lived with his family in a small, neat house near the Chesapeake Bay. Hildegard tended a modest garden. Their daughter, now 5, ran through the yard speaking perfect English, switching to German only when she was in trouble. The neighbors were military families, Americans, veterans of Europe and the Pacific, and yet they treated the Lurches as one of their own. At summer picnics, nobody cared that Hans had once worn the enemy's wings. They only cared that he brought homemade beer and stories that ended with laughter instead of bitterness. At the Navy Test Center, Hans's days were long and exhilarating. He evaluated everything from jet prototypes to carrier landing systems. The Americans wanted to understand the lessons Germany's engineers had learned under fire, what worked, what failed, and what nearly changed the outcome of the war. Hans provided the missing context, the human factor. "Technology is not just metal," he told young engineers. "It is the fear and the faith of the men who fly it." By the early 1952, his reports were shaping design decisions on new aircraft. The F-9 Panther, F-86 Sabre, and early supersonic testbeds. He approached every evaluation with the same precision he had once brought to the Luftwaffe's programs, but now his loyalty belonged to something larger than nationality. He had come to believe in the discipline and moral structure of his new colleagues, men who saw engineering not as domination, but as mastery through restraint. Yet the past never fully left him. Sometimes at night, he would wake to the echo of engines and the acrid taste of burning oil. Hildegard would sit beside him until the tremors stopped. "It's over," she would whisper. "You're home." But home was no longer a place. It was a choice one, made the moment an American sergeant had refused to pull a trigger. In 1952, Hans received an invitation to attend a symposium at Wright Field, Ohio, a gathering of engineers and test pilots from across NATO. There he encountered men who had once flown against him. One British pilot recognized his name and approached him during a break. "You're Lurch Messerschmitt Test Division, yes?" the man said with a grin. "I remember trying to catch one of your prototypes over Cologne. Bloody impossible." Hans smiled. "Then I did my job well." The handshake that followed symbolized something profound: reconciliation, not written in treaties, but lived between professionals who had seen the same sky from opposite ends of history. That same year, his second child was born, an American citizen by birth. Jake Larson, the P-51 pilot who had once debated him about turn radius and engine power, stood as godfather. At the christening, Larson raised a glass and said, "4 years we tried to kill each other. 4 years we've been friends. If that doesn't prove doing things the right way matters, nothing will." Laughter broke the solemnity, but Hans felt the weight of Larson's words settle deeply. Doing things the right way, even in war, especially in war. He thought again of the field in Bavaria, the smell of wet earth, the
Look at
blood
the
in his
intake design
shoulder,
on this
and
thing.
the voice that shouted for a medic
brilliant
instead of
Yeah,
revenge. Through the 1,950 seconds and early 60 seconds, Hans continued to test aircraft for both the Navy and NASA as a civilian consultant. He flew over 150 aircraft types during his career, from piston engines to supersonic jets. Each test flight was more than data, it was redemption. Every takeoff was another affirmation that humanity could build not only machines of destruction, but instruments of understanding. In 1963, at the age of 54, Hans retired. His logbook was thick enough to fill volumes, his reputation solid across continents. He had helped shape the jet fighters that served in Korea and influenced the designs that would later patrol the skies over Vietnam. But for Hans, the real legacy wasn't in the aircraft. It was in what they represented: collaboration, mutual respect, and the belief that enemies could become allies without erasing the past. After retirement, he taught part-time at a small aviation engineering school in Maryland. His students loved his precision, his dry humor, and his quiet insistence on discipline. Machines, he told them, do not forgive arrogance. The sky rewards humility. But occasionally, when class ended, he would linger and tell stories not about victories, but about survival. About the day a man with a rifle chose decency over orders. By the 1,980 seconds, Hans was an old man. His accent had softened, but never disappeared. His daughter had married an American Navy pilot. His grandchildren spoke no German, but they knew the story of their grandfather's war, how he had fallen from the sky into the arms of his enemy and found a second life there. When a military historian interviewed him in 1985 for an oral history project, Hans sat in his modest living room surrounded by flight memorabilia and family photos. "What did you learn?" she asked. "From fighting for Germany and then working for America?" Hans was silent for a long time. Then, with the calm of a man who had spent decades reconciling his past, he said, "I learned that the measure of a nation is not in how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies." He leaned back, eyes distant. Germany claimed superiority, but it treated people with cruelty, even its own. America claimed to believe in human dignity, and when I was their prisoner, they proved it. They could have treated me as the enemy I was. Instead, they treated me as a man. That is real power, real civilization. He paused, then smiled faintly. And I learned that mercy is not weakness. The strongest men I ever met were the ones who could win a war and still choose compassion. When Hans finished speaking that day in 1985, the historian across from him hesitated, as if unsure how to respond to a confession that felt more like a benediction than an interview answer. The tape kept rolling, the hum of the recorder the only sound in the room. "Do you believe," she finally asked, "that the way the Americans treated prisoners actually changed the course of the war?" Hans's reply came instantly. "Absolutely," he said, his voice firm despite his age. "Mercy is not just moral, it is strategic." When German soldiers realized they would be treated fairly by the Americans, they surrendered more willingly. When pilots like me knew we would receive medical care instead of a bullet, we stopped fighting to the death. The Americans saved their own lives by showing humanity to their enemies. He leaned forward, the gravity of the moment filling his words. "It's something the world still doesn't fully understand. Strength isn't just about how hard you can strike. It's about how much restraint you can show after striking. That's what wins peace." For a long moment, neither spoke. The historian finally reached out and switched off the recorder. "Thank you, Captain Lurch," she said softly. Hans smiled. "No," he answered. "Thank them." 18 years later, on
Absolutely.
February 13th, 2003, Hans
Why
Werner
it is
Lurch
strategic.
passed away in his Maryland home at the age of 84. His obituary ran not only in American
Surrendered more willingly.
newspapers, but in aviation magazines across Europe. They called him a pioneer of test aviation,
Fighting to the death.
a bridge between enemies, and the German who helped America conquer the jet age.
Showing
The
humanity
funeral
to
was
their
held under a
enemies.
pale winter sky. The small chapel filled with veterans in dress uniforms, American pilots, engineers, and officers who had once shared flight lines and flight risks with him. At the front sat his wife Hildegard, her hands clasped around a folded flag. His daughter and grandchildren, all Americans now, wept quietly beside her. And among the mourners stood men who had once fought against him. Captain Jake Larson, now in his 80s and walking with a cane, approached the podium. His voice, though aged, still carried the confidence of a man used to speaking over engines and wind. Hans used to joke, Larson began, that he got shot down over the Rhine and landed in America. He meant it literally that day in 1945 when his Messerschmitt went down. But he also meant it spiritually. He landed in a country that gave him a second chance, and he spent the rest of his life proving that mercy can build more than weapons
He was a
ever
devoted
will.
husband and a loving
He
father.
paused,
We
looking
will miss
toward
him
the
dearly,
flag-draped
but his
coffin.
spirit remains with us.
We didn't just win a
Today, we
war,
honor the memory
we
of
won the
those who
peace. And Hans
Their
was
courage
proof
brought our
that we
nations
did it the
together in
right
fight
way.
for freedom.
Silence followed. Then, somewhere in the back,
Hans.
a child's voice,
Hans used
one
to
of
joke.
Hans' grandchildren,
His
whispered,
Messerschmitt went down.
Opa flew to heaven. The room smiled through its tears. After the service,
But he also
Larson
meant it
stood with Hans's
spiritually.
daughter outside the chapel. Snow fell softly around them. He talked about you often, she said. Larson nodded. Your father taught me as much as any instructor I ever had. He taught me that the real test of honor isn't how you fight, it's how you forgive. They shook hands, the gesture that had once symbolized surrender, now sealing friendship that had outlasted nations and ideologies. In the decades that followed, Hans's story found new life in military academies and ethics courses. His name appeared in
He talked
lectures
about you
on the
often.
human dimension of warfare and in discussions about the Geneva Conventions. Cadets studying
Your
international
father
law
taught
listened to
me.
recordings of his 1,985
forget?
interview. The clipped German voice describing a single act of mercy that reshaped a man's life and rippled through history. What happened on that cold March afternoon in
Your attention to detail here
1945
is
was
paramount.
more than a
This data will
rescue.
inform the operational
It was a
planning phase,
microcosm
determining
of what the
resource allocation for the
American
next quarter.
military doctrine strove for: discipline over vengeance, professionalism over passion. It was a reminder that winning a war requires more than weapons. It requires ideals. The
Reshaped
sergeant who had
a
lowered
man's
his
life.
rifle was never identified in official records. But his decision to call for a medic instead of a bullet had consequences that reached far beyond the muddy Bavarian field where it began. It saved a pilot, yes, but it also preserved something harder to define: the belief that even amid destruction, humanity could endure. Because of that moment, a German child grew up in peace. That child's children grew up American. And somewhere in the calculus of history, one man's compassion helped turn enemies into allies nations that would stand together through the Cold War, through crises, through half a century of fragile peace that held because enough people remembered how it had been won. March 1945, over the Rhine, a burning Messerschmitt fell from the sky.
Easy now, you're gonna be all right.
Hans Werner Lurch
little
had
tight here.
every reason to believe that when he hit the ground,
Almost done.
his story would end there in pain, in captivity, in death. Instead, a sergeant's voice shouted for help, not vengeance. A medic's hands worked quickly and gently. A cigarette was shared. A rule was followed. 58 years later, that moment was still echoing in classrooms, in families, in alliances. This was not just the story of one man's survival. It was the proof that principles, the kind written in treaties and the kind carried silently in the hearts of soldiers, can change the course of history. Mercy had been stronger than fear. Discipline had been stronger than hatred. And because of that, enemies had become brothers, and war had given birth to peace.